So, Ashad Saab, where is the semester now in Jamia? Like, when is the semester ending, etc.? Any indication?
Semester 3 is starting from tomorrow. The classes will start online tomorrow.
Okay, I see.
The first class from tomorrow. So semester 3 is starting. And for semester first, certainly, the admission test has been there. Results are to come, and so it will take some time. But the final year, semester 3 will start.
Okay, good. So.
And that will be also I will be able to motivate the students better, because when I will be taking the classes and things like that. So that will be better. So we can see to it and enthuse them, because many of them we are not able to meet because the physical things are not there. So that is also one of the reasons. But from tomorrow the classes will be there. I'll be taking, because this term I take business strategy, and I take consumer behavior, and international marketing.
Okay, wonderful. So so you will be
So, and even in consumer behavior, when I will be taking, I will trying to have a few sessions of yours, because that will give my students more and more practicality and things like that.
Inshallah, we will talk about that. So
depending on your busy schedule, we will try to fix something.
So the thing that I just wanted to sort of understand a little bit is our classes still going to be online or
online, sir. Still online.
Till when? Do you have any idea?
Though they gave us the notice that some practicals and all that has started offline.
Okay.
So I think slowly within 2 or 3 months, I think they will be doing the offline classes.
Okay, I see.
It is the first step to that, what I think, because the PhD students and the final year practical students, they are giving them a chance to that, with the protocols, they can come in the university and do that.
Okay, I see.
So I think in another 2 months, things will be quite okay and things like that. They will normalize it, because schools and all are running. DPS and others, it has started in Delhi, and schools are running. Even Delhi University, again, the final year, they have started with the practicals and things like that.
Okay.
So certainly, I think, because now cases are also controlled and things like that. So we hope for the best, inshallah, things will be. The only problem is with the hostels. So, they're managing the hostels, and then, I think things will be okay.
Sure.
Because the moment offline takes, we will be able to, bring more justice and things like that.
Sure.
So in the online part, some things are there, but some changes we are trying, and we are trying to be strict on some things, because we think that the approach which is going on, and they are not taking the benefits. It's very bad. So so I will try to invigorate that so that better things can emerge, sir.
Thank you. Zoubair,
yes, sir.
Did you send out a message to the students?
Yes, sir. We have circulated the message in our other group as well.
Okay. Chaliye, theek hai. Hopefully.
One more thing, Asim Saab, one more thing. You wanted to meet our faculty. So whenever you believe.
Yeah, inshallah, we'll talk about it later, Nashad Saab. So let's, set up a time and,
Yeah, whenever you are free, you can tell me. I will arrange it.
Yes.
I will arrange it, Asim Saab.
Yes.
That will be my privilege. because you are
Inshallah.
doing a great job, taking lot of efforts, and we are not taking full use of it.
Inshallah, we will talk about it. So, Zoubair, what do you suggest? Should we wait a few more minutes before we start, or?
Sir, I mean, we have circulated the message. By the time we will be done with the introduction, or we will be into the initial phase of the presentation, I guess more people will be joining. And since we are even live, so I mean, if people will join on the YouTube live as well. So yeah, we can start in a minute.
Yeah. Okay, certainly, yes. And once we are done, I will call you, and we can communicate
Sure, sir.
more about how we can improve the response, right? So which is not where it should be. So you want to, Zoubair, do you want to first test to see screen sharing is working?
We have tested, sir.
We
Okay,
tested that already.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So I think the plan of action, Zoubair, is that Zoubair is going to introduce you, and then you can start your presentation. And of course, the students know that this is going to be interactive, and so we want to make sure that we have as much conversation as possible given the numbers here. So, Zoubair, please go ahead.
So just a second, sir.
Thank you, Professor Ansari. Good evening, everyone, and good morning from my US resident people. Thanks a lot. Thanks for this session, Mr. Ansari and the City Foundation. For today's session, I would like to introduce our mentor, Mr. Zoubair. Zoubair did his master's in financial engineering, statics, and microeconomics from NSO Paris Tech. He is currently residing in New York and functioning as executive manager at BNY Mellon, head of front office analytics and partnerships. Zoubair is responsible for developing banks' analytical offerings and solutions for the asset management marketing segment. He held the position of managing director, head of investment analytics in State Street for more than 6 years, and he brings more than 26 years of experience in finance. Zoubair has published 2 papers. First, yield curve decomposition and fixed income attribution, and the second one is measuring financial risk into the 21st century. We are happy to have you, sir, today, and the stage is all yours now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to actually present this very topical subject around fintech. So first of all, let me share my screen so we get set up with that part. Start broadcasting. Okay. Oops, sorry. Oops. Okay, here we go. So is this good? Like you guys see the presentation, so we should see the presentation by now.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so the subject or the topic this session is going to be about fintech. It's a very vast subject, obviously, but we're going to focus on financial markets specifically, and we're going to look at some of the disruption happening due to fintech, and as well the opportunity, which is the innovation here, right? So as you probably noticed if you traveled in many countries, certainly in the US, banks typically build to last forever. So when you get these buildings you see in New York and Philadelphia and other places like large capitals, you're going to see this massive building. The one you see on the screen is actually a former building of Mellon Bank, which is the bank I am working at now. I mean, Bank of New York is the first ever to be
Zoubair, you're muted. Zoubair, You are muted now, Zoubair.
Mute. You guys hear me now?
Yeah, we can see you now and hear you now, but we cannot see your presentation right now. We can just see your.
Okay.
Yeah, this is it. Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So take two. Sorry for that. For some reason, it muted me on its own and asked me to if I wanted to unmute. Either way. So I'll go back and talk about this presentation about financial technology, specifically talking about financial markets today, talking about the risks, which is the disruption of these markets, but as well the opportunity through the innovation, thanks to fintech. And as you might have seen in the US and other places, oftentimes the banks in the past were built to last. You had these very imposing buildings that conveyed the idea that those are very powerful institutions that will never die. The one you see on the screen here is the Mellon Bank in Philadelphia. That's actually basically the ancestor of the Bank of New York and Mellon Bank I work for now. That is more than 200 years old. So with that thought in mind, others have done the same thing, right? There's a very famous movie rental that did the same and had this very impressive building, and they thought that would last for a long time as well. Well, what happened to Blockbuster? I mean, when I moved to the US about 23 years ago, I remember still getting the movies from Blockbuster. I'd go get my my videotapes, and watch them and return them back to Blockbuster. At the same time, around the same time, there's another company that started offering slightly different business model, right? And that company, Netflix, basically was looked down upon, and people said like, "Oh, this is not gonna do it, right? Blockbuster will never die." I still remember these discussions having with friends, where I was a big fan of Netflix. I like their model. At the time they were sending you CDs. You can watch up to 3 CDs and then return them, or return one and get one. But then you could see actually how, first of all, they didn't have these tapes, they had CDs, so it was digital already, and the system started changing. And very quickly, you can see what happened to that movie rental, right? Netflix revenue increased from, 0 to $7.5 billion in the span of 15 years. Whereas Blockbuster just like collapsed, and Blockbuster wasn't a small business, right? Blockbuster was a multi-billion-dollar business at that time. So, so you can imagine the same question being asked about banks. It is going to happen to banks. Banks are going to vanish. Are they going to be replaced by other companies, right? If you believe what the CEO of the largest bank in the world, JP Morgan Chase, says, I mean, this is his annual report, 2020, and many other interviews you might find on the web of Jamie Dimon. He's seriously worried about the risk of disruption due to fintech, and that on many levels, right? It's not just the growth in shadow banking due to the fintech technologies. As well, the big techs, obviously, the Amazons and the Googles, right? So there are actually many players in the marketplace that actually disrupting or potentially disrupting the financial market business, right? The worry is very serious. I mean, if you read the annual report by Jamie Dimon, he's extremely worried, right? And he sees this threat not only to one part of the bank, but pretty much across all activities in the financial market, in the banking world. So the players in fintech, they touch many sectors. I mean, if there is something that is common to the fintech industry, is its diversity. I mean, it is touches every sector, subsectors, areas of our daily life. When you think about fintech segments, the biggest trend is really the diversity. There's an explosion of that, right? And that has been largely driven by the impact of the pandemic. The pandemic, the last 2 years, have been really driving a lot of that in terms of the use, the adoption of fintech tools, as well on the consumer side, retail side, but as well on the business to business side. So if you think about the payment space, that's probably like one of the most common that people actually see and impact their lives a lot, is like they can pay more easily, right? But it's going beyond person to person, right? And bill payment. There are solutions increasingly embedded into offerings now. There are retail apps, and there are an entire ecosystem platform that is being built, right? Keeping the sector in top spot of fintech funding. So there are a lot of names you see on the screen, but if you look at one of them, one of the biggest ones, Alipay, it's tiny actually in the bottom there of payments. And not only they're offering payment, but actually they're creating an ecosystem of fintech technologies whereby they offer other services beyond payment. Okay, and this is where some of the disruption is happening potentially. So we are seeing really surging interest in RegTech as well, investments, right? And you can see as well things changing in InsurTech, right? So cybersecurity is another aspect of the fintech changes and disruption and innovation in the banking sector. It is one of the top 4 probably like worries of the banks, cybersecurity, which is on the pace to see a record level of annual investment by the end of this year, right? So at the same time, you have other things happening. You have an interest in cryptocurrencies. We'll talk a little bit about that. There's a blockchain. We'll talk about that, right? And the appetite for investing is not just by investors, but also from government and regulators. That's gaining momentum more and more, right? So while global investment in places like, if you think about wealth tech, right? So robo-advisors, right? And that's far surpassed the 2020 annual high at mid-year this year, right? You can see how that is changing really fast. So there's an acceleration of that, probably due to the pandemic, and certainly due to the pandemic. The positive, so public market activity from like the insurance business, InsurTech, right? If you look at from both an IPOs and SPAC merger, has driven basically in this space the valuation up to basically record levels in the first half of 2021. The deal size and the diversity basically of the fintech investment propelling the global InsurTech investment is incredible this year. So there is no doubt that there is a lot of money, right? And there is a lot of going into the fintech, right? So it is very exciting. It is fastest growing sector in areas of business. And while, again, the definitions might be simple, right? The products and the companies that I showed you on the screen that employ newly developed digital and online technologies in the banking and financial service industries, and how it's used and its impact on consumers is much, much more complex. In fact, in a very short time, the emergence of a new generation of fintech has greatly impacted how we actually do business, how we transact as customers, how we think about the future of finance. You heard Jamie Dimon, and among other things, it is significantly blurring the lines between business services, allowing bankers, advisors, and technology providers to provide nearly identical services. So this is where Jamie Dimon is worried. He's worried about, the players like Google and Amazon to come in and take his business, literally, right? So, so this is something we're going to look into in this presentation. So again, I talked about this diversity, but today I'm not going to go through everything. I just put like here in front of you a number of things. I mean, we can talk about InsurTech, WealthTech, and RegTech, etc., but probably won't have time to talk about everything. So I'd like to focus on maybe some of the most visible fintechs in the banking industry, payments. I'll talk about loans and blockchain, because I think those are the sectors probably where we're going to see the most impact, positive and negative, right? So there'd be more focus on these, but obviously this is not limited to that. And for actually in capital markets and trading, which I should have highlighted in red as well. So very quickly, give you an idea on the investment. Global fintech investment already reached $98 billion, right? There's a record setting in terms of VC volume driving this, basically fintech surge, but as well, there's the banks investing as well. So VC is one thing, but banks have invested heavily as well into the fintech industry. And the levels that we see already half year through are incredible and rebounding from a little bit pre-pandemic. So what is that really happening here? 10 years ago, when I was in banks, a different bank, but in banking, again, the worry is that the fintech startup and the technology giants would displace them from their traditional business. Okay, the worry is still there. Has that happened? No. Would this happen? Probably not. Banks will still exist, and we'll explain how, but I doubt they will be fully replaced. They will change, will bank differently, but the banks will still exist. And one of the reasons, because banks have endorsed a lot of the fintech technology as a survival necessity, right? So for banks, there is actually great potential to get a bigger share in the market from other banks. So probably consolidations as well would happen, but as well to compete against some of these big techs and keep them at bay. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about payments, right? And try to explain what's happened here on the payment side. So if I ask the audience here to tell me how many of you guys have a smartphone, and if I ask you to send that by chat, or just you can talk, I assume that pretty much everybody is going to have the answer yes. I doubt that it's going to be less than 95% of the attendance not having smartphones. Now, the question is, how many people had smartphones in 1990? That's not too long ago, right? It was 0.2%. Less than 1% of people, right, had smartphones back then. So in 25 years, you go from 0 to 100. The pace and rate of innovation has accelerated tremendously, right? So not that fintech didn't exist. Fintech existed. I mean, if you think about an ATM machine, that's fintech. If you think about credit cards, that's fintech, right? But now it's springing everywhere, right? And if you think about, again, the companies that are in fintech that you see on the screen, Alipay, huge player. China is leading the way in payments with Alipay.
Zoubair, we are unable to hear you. Zoubair?
I guess Zoubair Sahab has been out of this meeting now, or he's having some issue with the network.
Zoubair, we are unable to hear you. I'm trying to reach him on phone, but he declined the call.
I think let's wait for a while, Professor.
Professor Ansari, he was out of the meet and he has just sent the.
Okay. That's fine. Okay.
Yes, he'll be back in the meeting.
Okay, perfect. Okay, that's fine. Okay, yeah, he is here now. So. Okay.
Hi, did I lose connection?
Yeah, I think that's what happened, Zoubair. You lost connection. We couldn't hear you for a few minutes. I tried calling you. So
yeah, when you called me, it actually got me out of the. It's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it was good that I called you then.
So let me. Do you know where it got interrupted?
Well, if you go back in, I will tell you.
Okay.
I mean, we just lost you for just a couple of minutes, so nothing much. So.
Okay, let me. I'll. Could you still hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, and was I on this slide?
Yeah, you were on this slide. Yes.
And
okay.
You were at the point where you were saying that Alipay is leading the market. China is leading the market.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So I didn't lose too much of my. Okay. Sorry for the interruption. So yeah.
The one thing,
Zoubair,
Zoubair, you will have to make your phone horizontal.
Is this better now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. So yeah, I was saying that the payment, so person to person, right? Payment, like the is a very important change for the developing market, right? So if you think about the US or or Europe, it's not as disruptive, meaning like it's not adding much value. We still have basically in markets like the US, you have a very developed credit card and debit card kind of. Everybody has a debit card. Everybody has a credit card. So, to actually start using the PayPals and the Apple Pays, people are using them, but it's not as disruptive or as changing. It's still a small share of the market, right? Compared to Alipay or WeChat. I mean, in China, nobody uses cash anymore, but a lot of people didn't have the same kind of access to the credit card kind of or the banking cards. If you go to places like in Africa, right, where the systems haven't developed into the banking and people didn't have in the first place any credit cards, then definitely the impact is much bigger, and that's where you can see kind of a disruption, right? And so depending on where you are, obviously this is going to play differently. But again, as much as these are actually a huge improvement in people's lives, right? I was saying like ATM and credit cards were as well fintechs, right? But there's something you should notice though about this list of companies here, Alipay, WeChat, etc., is that they're all young companies and they're using actually diverse technologies. They're not exactly using the same technology sometimes, and they're getting established in money transfer and payments, right? So this is something real that is happening, right? Now, effectively, the increasing involvement of non-financial companies like this ones in non-tech companies has been growing, right? But not only from the likes of PayPal, right? If you listen again to Mr. Diamond from JP Morgan, he would actually tell you how he's worried about IKEA buying 49% stake in a financial service company, right? Or Walmart, and that's actually a big one. Walmart announced a partnership with Ribbit Capital to create a fintech to offer digital financial product. I mean, hear me well, they're going to offer digital financial product. So they're not using this to sell more Walmart goods. They use this to actually enter the financial markets, right? Similarly, IKEA taking a stake in a bank is to provide consumer banking services, right? And finally, Walgreens announced a partnership with MetaBank. This is all happening this year, right? To offer bank accounts in store and online. So basically replacing some of the financial services offered to customers here. So, and Walgreens is actually use banking as a service platform by another company called Income Payments and debit card issued by MasterCard. So you can see how it's changing. It's not just the usual kind of small companies, like new companies, young companies. Even this older player in the market, like Walmart, Walgreens, and IKEA, are coming in and trying to take a share of that market. So when we hear that the threat to banks is from every angle, it is from every angle, right? So depending on what you're looking at, right, consumer lending or wholesale payment, retail deposits, all these actually are sectors that are a threat for banks to actually lose market share. And the question is, are they losing market share? Well, they are, absolutely. So whether you look at the chart I showed you above, just before this one, or the graph here, over 10 or 20 years of time, the US bank have become much smaller relative to US financial markets. So that's a fact. And they've became smaller as well to the size of most of the shadow banks. So you can also see that there's a rapid growth in payment and fintech companies, obviously, and the extraordinary size of big tech companies. So this is combined together keeps banks kind of on their toes, right, in terms of these markets. So there's no doubt that that things are changing. So now I'm going to talk about lending, right? So we talked about payments. I'm going to talk about lending. That's another sector where we can see disruption, right? And you probably don't know this. There's a company called Signet. It used to be a monoline credit card company in 1994. And it was the 350th bank in the US. So way behind everybody else. And this bank has grown substantially over the last 2 decades to become the 9th largest bank in the US. Okay, so how that happened? I mean, and you can see it became Capital One. So Capital One is now this very large bank. It used to be the Signet, small bank not long ago. So how did that happen? With very much a straightforward business model, this bank has been able to drive growth and compete against its larger, more diversified kind of rivals, such as JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America. Well, the primary differentiating factor for Signet and Capital One has been its reliance on something that you all heard about, analytics, and the emphasis on innovation acquisitions. So this is where Capital One has had a very distinct edge over other players in the industry since the 90s, right? So Capital One was an early mover in using analytics to understand consumer spending patterns, right? So remember, like credit scoring, all these things typically were done and still done in many places as collecting some data about the behavior of your consumers, right? Do they pay well their debt or not? So the FICO score in the US uses a number of variables, 5 or 6 variables, I believe. And then they come up with a score, and the score lets you know if this person is someone you want to lend to or not, right? And some data, some regressions, that's how much data and big data it is, right? It was big data. I mean, if you think about it, big data always existed. It's not new, it used to be called statistics. Now they call it big data. But this bank has done something interesting, right? So to use the analytics to understand the spending patterns and introducing basically products and offers best suited to the requirements of very specific consumers, right? So their effectiveness of user analytics was discussed in a case study that you could find. 2014, there was a case study by Capgemini Consulting. And they noted that this bank has successfully built its business around the data, right? It collected. So, and they analyzed that data really well. And that's how they got that tremendous growth, right? So one thing they did is develop R&D. So what they did is they conducted tens of thousands of data experiments each year, basically offering credit cards with different interest rates, incentives, marketing techniques, right? And they lost money, right? So by doing that, when they lended money to these people who had bad FICO, rating, right? So other people who typically would not get a credit card, they end up losing money. But if you think about it, that money was R&D, right? I mean, you're experimenting and collecting information, right? And that information is used into a model, right? And that model basically gives you knowledge, and that knowledge is used to actually offer better products that suit the subset of these people that weren't captured as good customers by the FICO score, right? So this is interesting because this takes us to the information side of the finance. If you think about finance, it's all about information. This is our bread and butter. I mean, if you have the information, you can make the decisions, and that's how we make money. However you get the information and however you derive it, right? So data is not information. Okay, it's data. It's not knowledge. But then we have, over the past, 10, 15 years, the technology, the coding, the machinery, has evolved from simple regressions. People are using now algorithms that are much more complex. That people are using actually amount of data and able to process data much faster and much bigger sets, right? So it's really like interesting how this company did it for lending purposes, right? And how that model actually now is understood to be changing not just finance and banking, but every kind of aspect of our lives, right? So basically, big data, the analytics on top of big data will actually lead you to make decisions, and better decisions than your competition. Okay, I'm going to give you another example just to illustrate a little bit how data and information is at the core of actually making this decision. So I'll be quick on this one, but basically there was a story in the news, the New York Times, about this dad who has a teenage daughter, and she has received marketing material that are related to actually a pregnant woman, right? So he got really upset. The father was upset that they would, Target would send his daughter, his family, specifically targeting his daughter, actually, because it was her name, a pregnancy items. So he went to Target and complained about it, and he said, "Hey, you guys need to have better marketing targeting tools." So what Target told him, they said, "Oh, sorry, we apologize, etc." But honestly, the algorithm that we use actually kind of identified her as a good target and recipient of these items. Say, how dare you, etc. Well, to make this long story short, the daughter was pregnant. The dad didn't know, right? I'm not sure she knew, but she probably knew. But exactly what's happening is, depending on what you buy and depending when. So if you buy calcium, zinc, magnesium for 20 weeks, and then later on you start buying unscented lotions, and then later on you start buying scent-free soap, the algorithm that's trained to understand that you're probably going through pregnancy, right? So obviously the father was very surprised. But this is how actually Target knew more about this dad's daughter than himself. So, and that's something that you probably now all going through. We are all going through the same kind of things, where there are companies that know more about people than the closest people around them, right? So if you think about another study that was done by University of Cambridge, and actually have on the internet, on this page, an algorithm that you can try, right? So the same way data was used, through regressions, the AI now is doing much more than that. And machine learning needs only to learn about, the case of lenders, how lenders categorize Facebook profiles, right, as training data. So, and then they develop a great scoring models, right? If you think about neural networks and deep learning, those learn better and make the machine make better decision than actually lenders. The lender will still make the final decision probably, but still these machines are helping a lot. So Facebook, actually, University of Cambridge has this algorithm on Facebook where you can load your information and they'll give you actually a profile, like a psychological profile of the user, right? This study that was done by University of Cambridge, not the company Cambridge, the one that actually was in trouble at some point, but the university, they actually showed that the Facebook can describe a profile that is closer to the person than anyone would know except for a spouse. I mean, that's how detailed it can be. And it's not only obviously your clicks, what you like. If you think about lending, right? I mean, if someone on Facebook is always liking, let's say, any story that has to do with, gambling, right? There's a good chance that this person is a gambler, and there's a good chance that you don't want to lend to this person, right? So obviously there are things like this. Even the open text, whatever you type can be understood, right? So the number of words that can be captured, right? And these words correlate highly, and sometimes the combination of these words can correlate highly to a specific behavior, a specific psychological kind of profile. And that can help you make a decision on lending or not, right? So,
Zoubair,
yeah.
just 1 second. Sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
Sometime wherever it is an appropriate time, you may want to sort of, let them ask you some questions too, if they have
Sure.
any in the middle. It's up to you how you want to do it.
Look, I could stop here. Actually, the good point. Thanks, Professor. Before I move on to a different subject, yeah, I mean, if people have any question on payments and lending specifically, those are the two subjects I discussed. So online payment, so person to person, versus and lending to people, or the technology. I mean, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Or the role of analytics also, I guess, is another thing
that too.
Yeah. So guys, please unmute yourself and ask the question. We want it to be interactive. So whatever question you have in mind.
I can ask questions as well and see if people have responses for me.
Yeah, well, you can do that. Yeah. Does anybody have a question?
But yeah, I mean, here's a question maybe, and maybe someone can respond to this. Do you think that a lender would actually lend to someone? Is it possible that a lender lends to someone who has no credit history? Is this happening? And in India, you probably see these things happening more than we see it in the US, right? Because there are different, new ways to actually microfinance in India that probably don't exist here.
Hello, sir.
Hello? Yeah.
Yeah, I think yes, sir. You can lend if somebody does not have a credit history, because there is company in India which is doing microfinance. Like they are profiling a customer based on what job they have. Like they are giving loans to people who are watchmen and these kind of jobs, and they are providing them loans in a small amount, and they can pay their in installment and after some time the full payment. I think that's
well, thank you for that. That's interesting because this is actually interesting in two ways. One is so they're lending to people knowing how much they make, which is interesting because if you look at the lenders in the US, the FICO score, which is the main way to actually assess someone's credit worthiness, does not have salaries in it. So that's actually an important one. And actually, just to take that idea, there are lenders who now they're actually fintech companies that can lend. You know the company Square, right? They actually do not get paid for their service, but they collect the data and they use it for lending, right? So the way they do it is they say like, well, if I see someone who actually, getting payments and sending payments off large amounts. And I know that they have a business like they're selling, I don't know, they have a food business, right? And I can see the transaction and I can see the amount that they're transacting, right? Well, if someone is actually transacting that way, exchanging, $30,000 a day and, to buy things and making $60,000 a day of income, well, then this is a pretty good business, and I probably should lend to them, even though these guys are functioning in cash, right? So because these guys, some of the business don't want to go to the bank, they don't want to actually divulge their incomes, right? And they're probably trying to hide something from the government. But matter of fact is that if they use Square, right, Square can actually not only understand their business, financially speaking, but they actually know that they can lend them, and actually they get into the lending business. So Square does not make any money through payment, even though they have a payment fintech. That's not how they make the money. They make the money through the lending. The payment fintech is free. Okay, thanks for that. So that's definitely, obviously, fintech in India, probably like helping out with some of this like microfinancing, definitely. Yeah. Any other questions?
Hi, sir. Yes, sir. I mean, I'm Faisal here. I'm from Hyderabad, but I stay in Nairobi, Kenya. I've been staying for the last 17 years. I'm the general manager in one of the companies here. So what here, sir, I mean, the system that we see, there are, banks here, like for startups without collaterals, they actually lend up to $30,000. So that is for the startup, but also for like existing business who is having issues of the working capital. What they do is, like, we call it here the value chain financing. So they basically, on invoice that, they actually finance. So they tie up with that, the supplier or the manufacturer, and they directly with the distributor. So they pay upfront to that supplier, and they hold like a risk fund, like a 20%. Once that the customer pays, then they'll refund that 100 years, that the balance 20% to the to the suppliers. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, and definitely in Africa, you're going to see more of this. So this is my point exactly, and thank you guys for pitching in. In places like India and in Africa, in China, where the banking systems weren't as developed as in the US, let's say, right? Fintech is playing a much bigger role, right? This is similar to like phone lines, right? There were more cell phones in developing world than actually there were cell phones in the developed world very quickly, because they weren't in the first place the phone lines as developed because of the infrastructure, obviously, and cell phones like had a much lighter infrastructure. So definitely those are disruptive in a way, but I think they're not making the banks in the US, let's say, shake, right? This is not what most worries the bank. Because if I ask you how many of you think that paying with your iPhone is disruptive innovation, you're gonna say yes, it is in a way, because we use it a lot. Yeah, in China, if you go on the street and you find a beggar and you give him like cash, they look back at you and say, "Do you have WhatsApp?" Right? So there's no cash in China anymore. So, but it's not disruptive, in my view, because these payments that we're talking about, right? They're actually all using the old legacy system. It's still using the same pipes and technology to make those payments using the Visa MasterCard system. It's basically putting kind of a UX, right, to a backend that hasn't changed. So this is what's interesting. So even though you have every one of these companies, except maybe for one, right, they're using the same old technology, right, and they're actually hooking to it. So it's not transformative in a way, because all the backend is the same. The experience for you is great, but you don't see what's happening in the backend, right? So for a bank and the banking system, it's not transformative, because the costs is the same. And this idea I'm going to use later on on a much bigger scale when we get to it, right? But the data collection is happening. Square, as I mentioned, but they don't make the money on payments, but they collect the data, and they're getting the data into lending. That's the only company that has a slightly different model than anyone else I mentioned today. So when is a technology becoming disruptive? It's when it disintermediates the system that sits in the middle, right? If you look at Venmo and PayPal, they allow you to keep the money into your Venmo account or your PayPal account. So I use Venmo. I can actually exchange money without using my Chase account. Honestly, I use a lot of my Chase account because I don't keep money in Venmo, so it keeps transferring money back and forth from Chase. So effectively, I'm using the same technology then that is behind the scene for Chase, right? Using the MasterCard, Visa MasterCard system. But if everybody kept their money in Venmo and kept their money in PayPal, yes, it will be disrupted, but it's not happening that way, right? Those are still like small amounts, right? Except maybe in China with Alibaba, right? And Tencent. Those are two companies that are more disruptive than any other company in the US in the consumer financial sector. Because Alibaba and Tencent, what they're doing, they're creating an ecosystem. It's not just payment. I mean, these guys, they will sell you, they'll sell you things, they'll lend you money, they'll give you mortgages. So they're actually collecting a lot of information and trying to use that data to actually find out more about its consumer to sell them other services. The payment by itself is not disruptive, right? So this is something that's an important point to keep in mind, right? So talk about payments, obviously, there is something called Bitcoin. A lot of noise, a lot of talk about Bitcoin. A lot of people made money, a lot of people lost money, but that's not our point. My point is Bitcoin actually has the potential to be really disruptive for banks because Bitcoin does disintermediate, right? This is very different. There's a disintermediation of banks when you use of the banking system when you use Bitcoin. So if you were to send money internationally through traditional banking systems across international boundaries, it's extremely inefficient and fee-driven, right? And that is because of the clearing and settlement houses that are behind the scene. When I send money from the US to my country in Africa, I know that it has to go through two banks. Besides my bank here and besides my bank there, or whatever the bank there. Oftentimes, sometimes it actually skips it, but depending on where you send it. For actually the bank in the US to send money to India, they have to have an account at that Indian bank.
Zoubair, we cannot hear you. Okay. We'll wait a little bit.
Zoubair sir has rejoined into the meeting.
Hi, do you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can, Zoubair. Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I really don't know what's happening actually. My internet connection is pretty good, but okay, so
one possibility, Zoubair, if you don't mind, I mean, if you think that is going to work, is you can send me the presentation. I will share the screen from here, and you can just talk.
Okay, so let's do it now since I have it on. I can
Okay.
do that meanwhile. So let me. Okay. So did you guys miss a lot of my Bitcoin discussions?
You just
Did
were
you guys-
saying that Bitcoin potentially is disruptive because it disintermediates, and that you were talking about, sending money internationally to, and the presence of two banks in the minimum.
Okay, that's good. So that's very costly, right? So the cross-border payment, if you think about, that's actually much bigger business than the payments you do, to buy something or pay someone for something, right? The transfer of money is a pretty large business compared to that. So people sending back money to their countries, right, from here to Mexico, from here to Africa, so or to India. So it's a pretty big business, and it's very costly, right? So there are systemic challenges actually to overcome there. Some are due to regulation, right? And some are due to the correspondent banking, which I mentioned, which is the bank in between the banks. Everybody gets their cut, and then there is liquidity as well issues, right? So typically the system is cumbersome. The piping it's a nightmare in terms of the amount of people involved in these transactions to clear and settle and transfer that money, right? So there is a potential for Bitcoin for Bitcoin to do that, right? But despite the fact that it's promising, you can see that the difference is huge from number of dollars to $50 compared to $0, right? Even though that's huge, there's a problem with Bitcoin. And the problem with Bitcoin is that it's highly volatile. You can see Brexit volatility compared to Bitcoin, right? So I'm going to ask the audience here, would you put your money in Bitcoin, like your entire money and savings, and put them in Bitcoin, assuming you could actually use that to do everything you need to do, buy things? And what would be the answer? And yes, and I mean, I wouldn't, right? The volatility is such as, you don't know what money you're going to have. And Bitcoin has another problem. It's actually expensive, right? In a way, in terms of energy, right? It's still the transfer is free, but it has high consumption of energy. It consumes more electricity than Argentina or even Switzerland, I believe, right? So and then there is actually basically data cost. If you actually invested or used Bitcoin, you'd see that sometimes it takes hours, right, before you feel confident that the money went through. The number of transactions Bitcoin can handle is very, very small still. So there are a number of issues with Bitcoin that are not solved, right? So it's not a good money. It's not a good currency because it lacks three fundamental characteristics of a currency. It has to be a good store value. I mean, look at the volatility. It has to be a good means of exchange, and it has to be a good unit of account. And all these three are missing from Bitcoin. I would attract your attention to the fact that if you actually went and bought something with Bitcoin, if you find someone selling something with Bitcoin, let's say gasoline, right? They would not label that in units of Bitcoin. They will label that in units of dollars. You can pay in Bitcoin, but it's in dollars. They will always get their amount on dollars. It's $3 a gallon, you pay me $3, right? But they will never say it's 0.00001 Bitcoin. So, and that's not happening. So I don't think personally that Bitcoin will be a currency, a viable currency anytime soon, not in the current state of Bitcoin. That being said, okay, there's something behind Bitcoin that is of huge interest to the banks, and that is a blockchain, right? Now, I'm not going to go through a discussion and an explanation of what is blockchain, but basically, we're talking about distributed ledgers, right? So if you think about what the bank do they transact a lot, right? Everything bank does is a transaction. There's a contract, and that transaction, right, is very costly nowadays, right? If you think about the settlement I mentioned earlier, settlement and clearing, right, is a very expensive business on a huge amount of money that are nowhere to be comparable to payments, peer-to-peer or lending, etc. And here I'm not talking about transferring money to India. I'm talking about payments in the capital markets. The size of capital markets, that you guys don't see that. Most people don't see that. Unless you work in the capital markets, you don't know that it dwarfs every other payment on the planet, right? Those are trillions, hundreds of trillions of assets. It's probably like, I mean, swaps and other like futures and FX future securities, all these amount, as you can see on the screen, they dwarf the world GDP. You see that, I mean, world GDP is actually basically 4 times smaller than what these transactions are about. And this is where the banks have an opportunity, right? This is where the banks can use the blockchain to intermediate, but actually to retire the entire securities and clearing settlement system, right? And move on. One of the worries the banks had is that Google does it, Amazon does it. They have the capabilities. Google, Amazon, they could actually create a system that is much more efficient than the banks, right? And they can go to actually hook up with the markets, right? Hook up with electronic trading and all these things, and replace the entire banking system. The problem is, to get into that business, they're going to have to be regulated and heavily regulated. There is no industry more regulated than the banking industry. It's actually more regulated than healthcare, right? And one of the reasons why banking is so regulated, especially since 2008, right, is because it's really seen as an extension of the state. The banking system is not just as any industry. It's basically at the center of the strategic importance for a country itself. So you can't easily get into it. And this is one of the reasons that they didn't get into it. But look, more and more, Google, Amazon, they're getting regulated. They have a number of regulations of their own. And if they end up thinking that it's worth the game to get a bit more regulated, right, and get into this play and start getting the banks out of their business, they would do it. For now, banks have a chance to basically change their entire system using blockchain. Those blockchains would not be outside of the bank. They'd probably be inside the banks, but the technology would be that. The ledgers, I mean, if you think about what those ledgers are, I'm going to take an example here of maybe a swap, right? So here, so that you understand. So the graph, not sure it helps you understand, but I'll go through it. So a common example is 2 asset swaps, right? Swapping is basically, I pay you something, party A and party B, right? Pay you something else in return. And so it's party A sends an initial settlement instruction basically to party B. And party B is going to send a matching settlement instruction. Okay. So this is actually done manually. A lot of it is actually done with faxes and paper. Just imagine the amount of documentation. It's tons and tons of paper, and they have to go and send them and scan them sometimes and enter them in the system and confirm that the data is right. And when the 2 parties agree, this clearing and settlement house says, okay, done. So you take this money at the end of the day, you take that money at the end of the day, we settle the deal, right? In the blockchain world, the settlement instruction is basically a smart contract. It goes on these ledgers, right? Distributed ledgers, right? And then they do the job electronically, right? And they're very secure. You don't have to worry about, cybersecurity and things, because those are very secure ledgers, encrypted, right? And basically everything is done through what we call a smart contract. And that's include every relevant information such as asset 1 and asset 2, quantity 1, quantity 2. Blockchain is going to address that for both parties, right? And it's going to be immediate. So what takes hours and days can be done immediately at a fraction of the cost. This is where the real disruption is, okay? So atomic swaps, for instance, they allow the execution of 2 smart contracts in a way that, let's say, party A receives an asset from party B, only if party B has received an asset from party A, and vice versa. Well, guess what? If you wrote any code, it's really easy. And if then kind of type of condition, right? on the ledger is very easy to write, right? In a setup like this, you conduct the task by clearinghouse, right? An entire clearinghouse, employing dozens of people, right? Just a program can do that. A computer program without any possibility to interfere with the execution. You can't even interfere with that, right? So a reconciliation conducted by a financial organization becomes something that is useless. We don't need these things, right? You must have read that a number of banks have already implemented, obviously, a lot of this technology. And a lot of their staff in China and India is gone. Their banks who actually, just in this kind of reconciliation processes, they have reduced their staff from like, to 5% to what it was. You don't need people for that because you have the technology. Any question on the blockchain? Or the financial market, or their sizes, or why this is actually more important for a bank than the rest. If it's not clear, I can always go back, explain a little bit.
Any questions, guys? Or Zoubair, how much more do you have? We could just finish things quickly and then maybe take some questions at the end.
Yeah, almost done actually. So what I wanted to really highlight is that the real challenge for the banks is to adapt these new technologies, right? And in particular, the distributed ledgers, right? So the derived from the blockchain technology, right? Adopt the smart contracts because that will help you on the market, the capital markets, but as well, this could work obviously on the payments as well, right? Remittances, etc. And then the bank's going to have to be extremely lean, transform the composition of the workforce. So what we see currently, even in my world, that we have less operational people, less and less, and we have more data scientists, we have more AI, we have more blockchain specialists, general ledgers and decentralized finance, right? And another thing I need to mention to you. So when I talked about capital markets, I talked about the piping behind it to basically clear and settle the deals, right? The millions and millions and millions of deals that are done every day, every minute, every second. But there's something else that's happening in the marketplace that is actually very important, which is tokenization. And the tokenization is to render assets into digital assets. So currently, the only one we hear about is more or less the currency. We have a cryptocurrency, but it could be crypto everything. Right? We can tokenize, technically, you can tokenize the house, the building. You can tokenize a security, a derivative, right? This is something that's starting, and this is something banks are investing in. It's very important to understand that the assets, as they become tokenized, they're going to run more efficiently, and they're going to run automatically, and they're going to be running on a new technology. The current technology doesn't handle that, right? So this is another trend, right? And you guys, as MBA trader, you're probably not asked to become AI specialist or technologist, but you need to have a lot of wisdom and the ability to actually see where the trends are and where it's happening. And probably that's what's going to be asked from you when you graduate, which is have some basic understanding of the technologies, of the problems, and have the ability to actually see where we're heading so you can prepare for it or prepare the business for it, right? And finally, regulation. Banks suffer from regulation. They're asking for less regulation, or like Jamie Dimon said, if you don't deregulate us, then regulate the other guys, right? Regulate the Googles and the Amazons, right? But again, if you regulate the Amazons and the Google, then they have nothing to lose. They'll certainly go after the banks, but it'll be like a level playing field. So it's probably like not a bad thing, right? So those are the challenges for the banks, and the opportunity is obviously cost reduction, efficiencies, right? And they have a real opportunity in actually because they have the money to incubate, and that's happening. A lot of incubation acceleration to facilitate the fintech engagements. They have capital investments in these companies. There's co-creation, partnerships, distribution. So every bank out there and there are probably 4 or 5 banks leading the march, but every bank is getting into this fintech business so that they actually can upgrade, right? They have to do what they call a digital transformation. Digital transformation, meaning transforming the entire business into new technology, running on new technologies, right? Being more efficient, reduce cost, right? And glean more knowledge through other things like AI and machine learning so that they can sell more to their customers and win bigger market shares from other banks and obviously fight back against the big tech. So that would actually end my presentation here. So I'll be happy to answer any question or go back and talk about a specific subject that is of interest.
Yeah, so you could stop sharing, Zoubair, and then let's sort of, open it up for any remaining questions. Perfect. So guys, anybody have a question, or you are all speechless?
Sir, I have a question.
Very good. Nafis, yes, please go ahead.
Yes, sir. So my question is, Bitcoin cannot be issued by an authority. It can only be mined. So what about the first Bitcoin? Who issued the first Bitcoin and to whom?
That's a good question of financial history. So the Bitcoin, we don't know exactly who did that, right? I mean, as you said, Satoshi, it's a name that's out there.
Satoshi Nakamoto, yes.
Yeah, we're not sure that that's the name of a person who exists, basically, right? It's so not sure, but he was definitely, whoever did it, if that person existed in California, then he's a super smart guy who basically understood the power of decentralization, right? And basically using every machine out there to actually make a copy of the ledger, right? Because that's what the blockchain is, right? So you have the ledger is copied many times, and every time there is actually it's linked to the next one. It makes this chain that actually has a linkage, right? That can't be changed. And if you actually change it somewhere, it breaks the entire chain. So it's highly, now who did the first transaction? Honestly, I don't know. I don't remember. I probably read about it. Can't remember like what was the first transaction, but it was it's probably like Satoshi who did it, was someone else, but I probably would have to go and look it up.
Yeah. So other questions here, guys?
I have a question, sir.
Yes, Faisal, yes.
Okay. Mr. Zoubair, like how many countries like legalize this, Bitcoin as like a legal currency? And then like recently I was seeing that El Salvador, okay, they also like legalize, they're distributing, like a $30 free to the, to the public. So how safe and what is the future of this, the Bitcoin, sir?
So, I gave you my my viewpoint on this.
Yeah.
I think it won't become a currency in the way it is now. As I said, nobody labels anything in Bitcoin. So for the reason I mentioned, right, because of its volatility, it doesn't have a unit. Money has to have a steadiness, right? You can't have that kind of changes that we're observing the Bitcoin now, because there's all this hype. Now, the Bitcoin is not controlled, right? It's not regulated. So there have been attempts to regulate it. China has been pushing a lot to regulate Bitcoin, but the essence of the Bitcoin as it is now is that it's not controlled by any entity or country. So would there be actually equivalent of Bitcoins, Fed coins, that are actually created and managed by the central banks, that is a possibility. Now, that could be a currency, but that would be a regulated currency on a ledger that is actually to some extent controlled by the central governments, right? But Bitcoin as a unregulated entity that is not controlled by any central government, right, is going to be a difficult proposition as basically an international money of exchange, right? So that is one of the problems, right? So having such an unregulated, and on top of that, obviously there is the other problem is without the regulation, Bitcoin can be the tool for a lot of criminal activity, right? So a lot of governments are worried that if they actually authorize a Bitcoin as it is now, which they have no control of and no understanding or insight into, it will actually end up being used for criminal activity, right? So those are some of the reasons why governments are really worried about authorizing the Bitcoin. So and if you, yeah,
I have a question, Zoubair. I guess in terms of maybe some student will ask it, but from the viewpoint of students, these are students who have just entered their second year of an MBA. Maybe they have some, 1 year of knowledge gain, and then of course they will gain knowledge as they, go through their jobs. So the question is, if one wants to sort of be abreast of all the current trends, etc., how do you sort of, keep up? What are some of the information sources that they need to focus on? Any general advice that you can give them in terms of improving their knowledge in all these, trendy and important areas for the future?
Yeah, obviously, I mean, that's a pretty open question. I assume like focus on the banking potentially, but I mean, like anything else, like, if you want to be aware of what's happening, the most important thing is to read and inform yourself, right? So, if you read a subject that interests you, you have to read about it, right? And you can read to some depth, right? So to understand, I'll give you an example, right? So, and this is very personal or experience, but this is in my previous employer, so State Street Bank. We've been struggling as a bank for many years to, to grasp basically the importance of let's say blockchain. So 10 years ago, they start looking and say like, yeah, it's important. We need to get into it. But they got into it in a way that is not deep enough, right? It's like, let's do something like marketing. But if people actually were able to read more in depth about the technology that's behind it and the impact that it can have on actually changing entire systems, right? They probably would have grasped that earlier. And some, like JP Morgan or Bank of America, they grasped that earlier on, right? I mean, I remember there was this thing I heard many years ago about JP Morgan, where the CEO said, everyone in the bank needs to learn how to code in Python, right? Or something. But he probably doesn't mean that everybody is becoming a coder, but everybody has to learn and understand a bit of what's happening to see the power of the technology and this transformative power, right? So definitely reading. There's a lot of material on to listen to as well, a lot of podcasts. But if you have a subject, try to get into it in as more in depth than probably you want to be, but that will highlight to you some avenues of changes that you may not be aware of. And it doesn't have, you don't have to read, like if you want to understand more about what changed banking, it's not only reading about banking, right? You probably diversify your reading because the tools you use in an area can be used in a different area, right? There, blockchain in banking, right? When I started my career and I was trying to build an extreme risk kind of methodology for the bank, for BNP back then, I didn't find anything in the banking that's being used. So what I did is I connected with someone I knew at Columbia University, who was a student. He was your student, Professor As. And I told him, like, hey, anything at Columbia University that has thing on extreme risk that you can find. So I did a search quickly, and he sent me a paper on extreme value theory used for building bridges, right? And I said, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know about that theory. I mean, I was like 2 years out of school, and I used that paper with 2 other friends and coworkers to build an extreme value theory model, basically, for the bank. We adapted something coming from building bridges to actually investing in the markets. So the more you read in different subjects, right, the more you will able to form ideas and views on specific area that you're working on. I mean, that's one advice. There are probably others.
No, invaluable advice, Zoubair. That's one constant, right? So I think Mubin Saab is here, Mr. Mubin, who is a mentor at CTI. Maybe he has some questions or some perspective to add here.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, sir.
Thanks, Zoubair. That's been a fascinating talk. And I was triggered by Dr. Ansari's comment that most of the audience here are students who are potentially be looking at careers. And given that there's so much of gray areas around this stuff, the question I thought that they would be having is that what kind of careers can students pursue in this field? Which companies? How do we reach those companies? What will they be looking for in a student who will be going for a interview process about 10 months from now? So very simple practical question as to what do they need to know? What kind of careers? What kind of jobs can they apply for if they want to go into this field at all?
Look, I don't know, Professor Ansari, do you want to take this one, or?
I mean,
yes, please.
Mubin Saab, go ahead, please. You're saying something?
Oh, was I not audible?
Yeah, no, you were audible. I guess one of the, let me try to answer this to a certain extent. So one way to sort of, think about this is, obviously it is impacting certain sectors. Both the universities that we have here have large programs, students interested in finance and banking. So clearly, this is going to impact them at the basic level in terms of understanding where the field is heading and where the future lies, and having some understanding of these technologies. The other thing that I learned, at least from Zoubair's talk, is the importance of analytics. So if the curriculum does not have a focus on analytics, or indeed, if the curriculum has some courses in this, my advice to all of you present here is that you need to take every opportunity that you can get to be good in analytics. So 2 general things, right? I mean, one is you need to know what's happening in these fields, especially if you have an interest in banking, finance, etc. So, of course, the payment space, blockchain, analytics, these are things that would be critical, cryptocurrency, etc. So I think that's where I would advise students. And if the universities don't have courses, then you need to look at courses on the platforms. So the Coursera's of the world, the MOOCs, etc. Will have stuff. And so, Python, this is general advice, not necessary only for Fintech. I think every MBA student needs to know Python or R or something like that. And, you know, you have to learn it on your own if you don't already know it.
Yeah, that's, I would second that, Professor Ansari. I mean, keep up to date with obviously the new tools, because in the example I mentioned about data on the Signet and all the models used to be regression. So obviously all the MBA students can run in Excel a regression quickly and get a trend line, because, you know, trying to predict something, get a view of the future. But obviously now it's R and Python, and you have to know some of that, even if you're business analyst, right? If you actually would be helping yourself by being able to run this analysis yourself, right? I mean, there's no expectation someone is going to do it for you. So to glean knowledge from data, right? As a banker, or if you're in consumer banking, or if you're in marketing, right? That's going to be definitely a differentiator. And honestly, it's less and less of a differentiator. It's more and more of a requirement, right? Almost a prerequisite that you have some level of ability to use basic, I'm saying basic tools in your day-to-day work, right? So Python is definitely
the other thing that I think one can look at, and I guess Zoubair, you would be able to share the presentation with them, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. So one way, just a very simple low-hanging fruit type of utility for students, either on this, you know, talk, or those who look at it later on, is that Zoubair had that very interesting slide about the different types of companies in this particular space. So there is a payment space, there is some other space, etc. So in terms of jobs, those are all places where, you know, maybe you don't get a job in Alibaba, but there will be an Indian equivalent to it. So in payments, maybe you have Paytm, you have many other things. So you have to sort of, you know, do the mapping exercise and try to figure out for each of those companies that are there in that particular slide, what the Indian equivalent is. And those are where the opportunities are, really speaking, right? So if you want to be part of startups, if you want to be part of a very exciting ecosystem, you have to put in the effort of making the Indian equivalent of the slide that sort of Zoubair had, of all the different, you know, I don't know, Zoubair, what were the different types of companies that you had there? There was payments,
there's lending, there's payment, there is insurtech, insurance, there is financial markets, so clearing houses, trading brokers, etc. So yeah, I'll send the slide definitely. And you're right, Professor. I mean, India has a lot of activity in the fintech startups and even like established businesses. So there are probably like 1,000 startups deals in India. I didn't mention these numbers, but 2020, India raised more than $10 billion, right, in terms of fintech. So so there's a numerous number of deals that India is actively working on and developing. So it's definitely one of the leading spaces as well. I mentioned essentially China because really it is globally it's a major player in terms of the size of investment. It's the US, but India is right there, being present and very active in the space, right?
So if there is a question.
Yes, sir. So, Mr. Zoubair, as we have seen in the last 5 years in India, as fintech companies are growing and also digital payment has increased, the banking sector has shrank itself almost to 1/10 of the workforce, and the job requirements which were coming in the last decade, it has shrank for like 1/10 of what it was. As the footfall also in the bank has been reduced to 5%, they are shifting to much smaller office spaces with a minimal amount of workforce. So after India has passed this phase of transition to digital payments and fintech and the merger of different banks, Is there any, are we going to see the requirement of workforce in the area of stats and blockchain in the banking, or it will be again on the previous track or the previous jobs which were existing before?
That's an excellent question. No, it's actually changing. So banks globally have been shrinking their workforces for purely cost control. I mean, including real estate, right? So real estate is changing tremendously. A lot of consolidation there, a lot of office closure, people working from home, etc. So that's going to stay. Now, it's true that the size of this bank changed, but what's happening is banks are shrinking and hiring, right? They're shrinking a lot of the roles, traditional roles that are more operational in nature, that are more like data intensive in nature, right? And actually replacing that by machines, code, right? And processes that are much better. Blockchain is only there to accelerate that. Blockchain is only there to change like tremendously. Like that is where there is a disruptive nature to the distributed ledgers, right? So there would be more jobs in AI, and there would be more jobs in machine learning, right? Definitely, that's going to increase because banks haven't staffed yet completely on those, right? I know that some banks in digital assets, like I talked about tokenization and digitization, I mean, they might have teams and large banks, they might have teams of 100 people, or some have 20 people. That's nothing. These teams are growing tremendously. I think there was an announcement from my previous bank, State Street, that they open an entire digital kind of research business in Ireland because of tax benefits. They opened like the office there, right? They used to be taxed at 200 people. They closed that down, and then they had to reopen another one. But they opened in over there, it's probably more than 1,000 people. So there will be more of that, right? So there'll be more technology focused, machine learning, AI kind of tools. And again, it's all because of the amount of data that's out there to analyze and information to gather so that you can offer services, right? It's all that circle, like, you know, I've got more data, I have more power to compute it, therefore I have tools to actually Python and others to actually run this code, and then I get knowledge. The one who has the knowledge wins. That's true in many places. It's very true in banking, right? So.
Yes.
Alaikum. If I may just add to what Professor Ansari and Zoubair has mentioned about the potential of careers, I would go one step further and say, just learning R or Python is not really enough, right? It used to be that when I was a teaching assistant, I used to teach COBOL to MBA students. It was a required course. It was just they took it and forgot about it. In today's world, technology is moving at a very fast pace, and someone who has, let's say, a minor in computer science, be it in AI or ML or any of these, or just understanding of distributed computing, of SaaS, of cloud technologies, is going to have a strong edge over people who don't, whether you want a career in banking or more so, if you want to disrupt industries and be an entrepreneur. There is just, like Zoubair said, there is just so much money that is chasing good ideas. I'm part of an organization that helps IIT startups get funding, and half of the companies in the present cohort are actually from India, entrepreneurs from India, and looked at a company called NetPaisa, and then they are just an example. They are revolutionizing banking by going into rural areas where people don't have bank accounts and so forth. So there's tremendous opportunity in India. And I would encourage you guys to not just stay with the business course, but get to know technology and think like an entrepreneur. There's just tremendous opportunity out there for you guys.
Thank you. Very valuable perspective, Madhusam. I think we are almost 1.5 hours into it, and we need to somehow, wrap up things. Unless there are some questions, I guess we should, Zoubair, if you want to wrap up, or somebody else wants to wrap up.
I have a question.
Sharon,
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Sir, this semester, Jamia has offered us optional electives as data science and machine learning, along with Islamic finance and banking. So people talk very much about data science, but we don't know much about Islamic finance. So should I opt for this subject, or is this something, if you can shed some light on this?
Zoubair,
I would.
Yeah.
Look, Islamic finance was a big buzzword, probably like when it started like 20 years ago. There's a lot of it. I honestly don't think that if you have to choose between that and the machine learning or AI, I think I would.
No, sir, it is a combination of both. I can choose both.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so if you can choose both, go for it. Because look, the tools you learn on Islamic finance is just a way of, the securities are different, right? They're structured differently, slightly differently. But in essence, it's very similar to what's happening in the marketplace globally, right? So if you're planning, I don't think that there is a huge market that differentiates basically like someone who has a Islamic finance versus not. They're very specific niche markets that they exist, right? In some countries, but effectively what matters the most here is that you understand how the deals in Islamic finance work. If you look at a bond, there's equivalent in Islamic finance, and there's a slight difference actually that makes bond halal versus not halal, right? Or an equity option, right? It's not that of a difficult kind of technical understanding, but the AI and machine learning, that will give you an edge in terms of really how to apply those to other problems, right? Nobody's going to ask you as an MBA to be like the specialist in AI and machine learning, but you have to have some depth and understanding in those aspects, even understanding things like, which is sort of cloud computing and what business impact cloud computing has. Similarly, like, look at some of the technology that exists to extract, even like tools like companies that extract data, that have built ways to extract data in a very fast way, in a very accurate way. A lot of the problems we're having is really about the data, right? And machine learning AI is there to help you manipulate and that data, infer new information from that data, right? I have a problem that came from me from the largest hedge fund in the world, actually, here in Connecticut. And they said, look, we have amassed what we think the biggest database of information that is out there, right? We have one problem though. When we be looking for something in it, it takes us forever to find what we need to find. That was probably like 10 years ago, right? So there are tools actually to help you that. So I would really focus on the data and data analytics, data technologies, right? It's really starting to explode even faster, right? I mean,
I agree, Zoubair. I think, given a choice, I would anytime take data science over Islamic finance. Right, machine learning is more specialized, but at least data science, business analytics, that's where the world is. You can get a job in Malaysia, maybe, or maybe in the Middle East with Islamic finance, but the opportunity.
Let me put it this way. Ask the Middle Easterns, the very wealthy ones, where they're putting their money, and they're putting them in Europe and the US. Okay, so
yeah, so yeah, I agree completely. So anyway, I think we should be ending now. So Zoubair, you want to wrap up?
Yes, sir. Sure. So thanks a lot, everyone, for being a part of this session. For the students, there is a notice that we have this session live on YouTube, and it's going to be there forever. So you can recap, and whenever you feel like being stuck up on the topics, you can just recap and replenish your memories and go and get the answers. And finally, I'd like to thank Mr. Zoubair for being here and being a mentor for this amazing session. And finally, also the SETI Foundation for giving us this opportunity to be briefed about and being insightful for this topic. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you.
Safdar,
Thank you all.
Safdar and other students, there's one more request. I'm sure you have a lot of students, fellow students who didn't attend this session. I think there is so much value here. You would do a great favor by publicizing, talk to your students and ask them to watch this. This kind of learning is very, very difficult to find. So publicize and get this out to your fellow students and anywhere you can. Use your WhatsApp accounts to send the link.
Yeah, I mean, Zoubair, thank you again. It was an amazing talk. I really enjoyed listening to what you presented. I'm a marketing person, but it was really phenomenal. Learned so much, and I hope that the students and the two institutions that are involved will benefit from this. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for attending and for the questions. And I will share the presentation. Professor asked me to send it to you, and then you.
Yeah,
share
I
it.
will manage it.
Okay, we'll do that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Aline, can you please?
Yes, sir. Yes.